right, it looks like we've got a good number of folks who have joined us, so we are going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, my name is Jessie Herman, and I'm the Director of Programs and Community Outreach with the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. We are delighted to welcome you to today's program with Sarah Dawn Petrin alongside Davidson College, and we would especially like to thank Jane Zimmerman for her coordination and moderation today. Sarah is an analyst at the Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, has been a lifelong humanitarian, and is an author who will today be discussing her most recent publication, Bring Rain, Helping Humanity in Crisis. You received a link earlier today with the first 20 pages of this book, which we encourage you all to go back and read, and then purchase the full book, which is also linked in that same email. As you might know, the World Affairs Council of Charlotte is a leading nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we're committed to bringing the world to Charlotte. And we do that by working to build a community of internationally informed and engaged citizens. We do have a few upcoming programs that we would like to invite you all to participate in. And there should be a link in the chat box soon where you'll be able to see all of those upcoming programs. So next Tuesday, we will be hosting a documentary screening of the Oscar-nominated film Hunger Ward, which will then be followed by an expert panel and discussion on famine and the war in Yemen. The following Thursday, we will be hosting PBS travel expert Rick Steves. And then on the 20th, our young professionals will be facilitating an international career panel and workshop that is probably going to be of interest to some of the students who are on the call today. You can also follow the World Affairs Council of Charlotte on all major social media platforms, which is a really great way to stay up to date with the different programming we have available. We're excited to have so many of you joining us today. We have a great group from World Affairs Council's members, Board of Directors members, students from Davidson College and Providence Day School, and our community and business leaders. So thank you for coming out today, and we hope that you're all ready to learn how we can all become humanitarians. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Jane.
Great, thank you so much, Jessie. My name is Jane Zimmerman, and I am the John and Ruth McGee Director of the Dean Rusk International Studies Program at Davidson College. Davidson College is a very proud member of the World Affairs Council in Charlotte, so a special thanks to Jessie and all my friends at the World Affairs Council. And a special welcome to Davidson students, faculty, and alumni. Anyway, I'm very proud today to be able to introduce Sarah Dawn Petrin, a humanitarian and an educator from Maine. Born in an African village during a season of drought, she has helped refugees since she was 15 years old. From responding to an active shooter in the capital of Washington, D.C., to being held hostage by a warlord in the Sahara Desert, she has borne witness to the radical acts of ordinary heroism that lead to global change. Sarah has worked in more than 20 countries with the United Nations and the Red Cross, and she is the founder of Protect the People. She is a voice of authority who advocates for people in need. She teaches on the protection of civilians and human security at the U.S. Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute. Sarah has a master's degree from the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University and a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations, French, and African Studies from Gordon College in Massachusetts. She lives in Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania, where she enjoys running with her wonderful dog, Toby. With that, Sarah, I'm so delighted and proud to welcome you here to Charlotte, even if it's Charlotte on Zoom and the World Affairs Council in Davidson. But if you don't mind, let me just go ahead and jump right into it and ask you, why is the book called Bring Rain? And why did you choose to write it?
Thanks so much, Jane. It's a pleasure to join you all. Thank you so much to Davidson and to the World Affairs Council of Charlotte and to Jessie. I'm super happy to be with you this afternoon as we get ready to enter into the holiday weekend. It's really fun to be here with you. And my new book, Bring Rain, the title comes from a story from a village in East Africa in Kenya, called Mumias, where I was born, and I was born in a season of drought. In fact, when I'm back in Kenya and I tell people that I was born in Kenya in a year of drought, they automatically guess my age and know what year I was born. And my parents were serving in missions in that particular area at the time as both a nurse and a teacher. So my mom and dad had specific jobs that they did to help people there. But when they brought me back from the hospital, the elders and the community held prayers and a rain dance and asked that I would be a good omen and that my birth would end the drought. And of course, I was just one day old and really an invited guest in their life, and I didn't have the power to change the season. But their hope for my life that I would be a blessing to others just stayed with me and has served as an inspiration to me in my humanitarian career. So that's why the book is called Bring Rain.
And who was your intended audience as you started putting this together?
Well, you know, when I first started writing this book, I was about to turn 40 years old. And I thought about my 20-year-old self. And I thought about what it was like to be a student in college. And, you know, every day I used to wake up and wonder what I would do with my life and my career, and where would I go, and how would I navigate the world. And I thought, you know, after 20 years of, you know, adult life and working, that it was time to share my stories with younger people who want to do this work, but maybe aren't getting the full story from the academic textbooks that they read, that are more based in theory and more serious thought. And I wanted to give them an easy read of stories and advice that painted a picture of what it's really like to work in the humanitarian sector.
So I'm curious, what did you learn about yourself as you wrote this book? I mean, did the experience of writing a book change you or offer you new insights as you put down and shared your memories, thoughts, and insights?
That is such a great question, Jane, because writing a book is so much different than you might think it is, particularly a book that is meant for a public audience like Bring Rain. Bring Rain is really meant to be a fun and easy read for people. And so I had to change my style of writing. As you know, having worked in the international sector, we write a lot of reports and we write a lot of publications. We write policy recommendations and program recommendations. So I had done a ton of writing, but I hadn't really written stories about the things I had experienced in a way that was immediately accessible to people who are not in our field. And so I worked with a writing coach for almost 2 years, who helped me adapt and change my style so that it was more approachable and easier to read. And I really liked the outcome. Ultimately, more than a dozen people helped produce this book, including copy editors and other stylistic editing that was done. So it really takes a village to produce a book.
Well, the results show, because it's definitely not like reading a dry field report.
Thank you. I was hoping that it would be different than that, for sure. You can read plenty of those online.
I think I mentioned earlier, this is the book I wish I'd had when I was starting out in my career, or back when I was thinking about my career back in college. So,
oh, thank you for saying that.
Absolutely. You also write about your experiences, a lot about your experiences in humanitarian emergencies overseas, but you've also worked here domestically in the US, particularly during Hurricane Katrina. And so what differences, if any, did you find in your experiences overseas versus those here at home, let's say for Katrina or other domestic crises or emergencies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, in addition to writing this book for young people and students who might want to work in the emergency management sector, I also wrote this book for people that want to make a difference in their communities, people that are volunteering and helping and serving others, whether you're staying close to home or going abroad. I really wanted to give people some practical tools to help them affect change in society. And we know the United States does not have a perfect disaster response system. We see this with the challenges with our Federal Emergency Management Agency, with FEMA. We see it with the crisis on the border with migrants and families and children. But we also see this when there are hurricanes and wildfires and storms. We often have a challenge meeting the moment in the same way that other countries do when they experience a crisis. And so when I tell the story about Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, I really am trying to point out the challenges that we still have in cooperation when we respond to major disasters. And we see this with COVID too. We see competition between the federal government and state governments, and competition between states and municipalities, and politics getting in the way of meeting people's needs. And this results in mixed messages that confuses the population and makes it harder to know where to go for help and when to expect to get help. Just like we have so many people waiting for the vaccine and they're not sure when they're going to get it. You know, we can do better in the United States. So I hope this book also inspires people to help close to home wherever they are.
That's terrific. I couldn't agree with you more. You also have an entire chapter devoted to Me Too, a global crisis. And in that chapter, you state that, quote, "Of all the problems I've worked to address, sexual violence has confounded me the most." Why is that? And what are your thoughts about the causes of sexual violence? And what can both men and women do to prevent it and break the cycle?
Yeah, unfortunately, the answer seems so obvious, doesn't it? I mean, sexual violence, the answer is to stop violating people's physical integrity and to stop abusing and discriminating against people based on their gender or their sexual preference. And I think that it seems so easy, but it's hard because we know in every crisis, in every emergency, that women and girls and oftentimes children bear the brunt of the violence, not only by external actors, but even at home within their own families. We see an increase in child abuse and domestic violence here in the US due to COVID. So we know this happens every time there's an emergency. And so we have to be committed to bringing this out into the open. And I really encourage people to talk about sexual violence. You know, I do training with the military on sexual violence, and it really makes people uncomfortable to talk about it. And I think part of the reason that people are so uncomfortable talking about it is they think it's about sexual relationships, where it's not. Violence is about power. It's about the abuse of power and people using their power in the wrong way. And so we have to change the way we talk about violence and change the power dynamic. And the more openly we talk about it, the more likely we are to recognize people that are suffering and choose to intervene on their behalf when we do come across a case or a situation of someone needing help.
And I love the way you point to people who've suffered sexual violence as survivors. And that really comes through so loud and clear. In fact, somewhat related is, especially regarding the vulnerability of women in many places in the world, including here at home. But one of my favorite stories in your book is that of a women's cooperative in Zambia and the organization Chikumbusu. And I love the story of how it took, the women there took action to combat HIV/AIDS. So could I invite you to kind of share that story with our audience here?
Yeah, thank you, Jane. It is one of the more fun stories in the book about community level transformation. And the important thing to remember is that the people that we're trying to help, whether they're our friends and neighbors or whether they're communities overseas across the pond, is to remember that they are not helpless, that they have agency, and our role is to support and empower them. So I served on the board of directors of Chikumbusu for several years. And this women's cooperative, they sewed bags, women's handbags from plastic shopping bags. Like they crocheted these plastic bags in all these different colors, and they sold them at the market, and they're just such beautiful bags. And when the women started making significant money with their earnings, they started providing loans to each other, and they would get together and they would meet and talk about what to do with their pooled money. And one day they decided to buy out the brothel in the middle of their town. And they saw the brothel as a direct source of their insecurity, because that is where the men would go to drink, to do drugs, to pick up prostitutes, and then they would come home and they would sleep with their wives and they would spread HIV/AIDS. And buying the brothel wasn't easy. The women really had to negotiate and really offer up a lot of money to do this. But once they bought it out, they turned the brothel into a community center in the middle of their township in Gombe. And now that you wouldn't even know that it had been a brothel. It's a safe haven for children. It's a playground. It's a training center for women to learn new skills. And it's just a beacon of light and hope in the community that, you know, was so bold of them. And this is what happens when we see people take control of their own lives. They can do amazing things to change their own circumstances.
It's really transformational.
It is so exciting to be part of it, for sure.
So I'd like to get your perspectives on how you see humanitarian need and action changing amid the COVID-19 pandemic. And what are the implications, particularly for, you know, young people interested in entering the humanitarian field?
Yeah, COVID has been a humbling experience for all of us. At the individual level, at the community level, and also at the national level. COVID has restricted our freedom of movement in new ways. And this is the same for humanitarians. You know, we're used to getting on a plane with a backpack and a few supplies and hitting the ground and running off and coordinating in meetings and talking to communities. And this is not always possible, right, with COVID. So we see less humanitarians in the field, as we call it, you know, going overseas. We see more people doing remote work. We see a greater challenge for local communities to do things themselves. And we also see a shift in the dynamic of power that is a healthy dynamic, that we need more national authorities to take responsibility for the welfare of their people and for managing crisis response within their own countries. I like to say that really we need to have a goal of making foreign aid less foreign and ensuring that every country in the world has an emergency management system that is diverse and inclusive and working with local communities. And so I think this COVID crisis is offering up a challenge for every nation to meet the moment and to really work in new ways to help others.
Great. Well, humanitarianism is based on the universal principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And as a result, it attracts and unites people from all different backgrounds, cultures, and faiths. But you also devote an entire chapter in Bring Rain. It's called Keeping Faith in Humanity. And it's a very candid discussion of how your faith has guided you both personally and professionally. So I'd be interested if you could kind of share with us how you see your experiences anchored in the universal and secular aspects of humanitarianism, along with those of your own personal faith.
Yeah, thanks so much. As we know, humanitarians really take a pledge to abide by humanitarian principles. And maybe this is not as well known to people outside the sector, but some of those principles are neutrality, that we help people regardless of politics. So it doesn't matter what party you belong to or what side of a conflict you're on. The only thing that qualifies you for receiving help is being a human being. And that's a pledge that we all take that's part of the Red Cross principles. And there's also a principle of universality, which is recognizing that human nature has a universal component and that we're to celebrate the humanity in every person. And this means embracing diversity and also having a firm commitment to non-discrimination. And we know that humanitarians aren't perfect. They're not saints or superheroes, but we do pledge to treat people with equality and to not discriminate based on race or nationality or gender or sexual preference or any other aspect of a person's individual identity. We just care about their human welfare. And so as a Christian woman and as an American, you have to realize when you work in this sector that you're going to work with people of many different faith traditions. You're going to work with people who may have no faith at all, that consider themselves to be secular or agnostic. And then you also will work alongside people of the Muslim faith and the Hindu faith and Buddhist faith and Jewish faith and so many different traditions. And so I think that having beliefs is part of universality, that everywhere we go, people have beliefs. And this is one way we can understand each other and understand different cultures. But for me, I have always been guided by this idea that even when I'm faced with limitations of what I'm not able to do to help people, I believe that there's a God who sees the bigger picture, who cares for humanity, and who is working to intervene at a level beyond my ability. And the title Bring Rain kind of brings this out as well, that there's a story later in the book about a time when I did pray for rain and there was relief for a drought that had gone on for 7 years in a particular place where I worked. And I see these kinds of things as miraculous, that the rains brought more relief to people than I could have possibly done, even with all the millions of dollars that I was programming, working for the UN at that time.
It's a great segue into my next question for you, but I'm going to pause for just a moment and invite our guests to take advantage of the Q&A function in Zoom. If you're on a computer, you'll likely see it on the bottom, a little icon that says Q&A, and you can type in there questions for Sarah, but I'm going to go ahead and ask at least one or two more, but hopefully we'll start seeing the Q&A populated with some questions.
Great.
I'd love to ask you, Sarah, empathy is considered the hallmark virtue of, the best and most effective leaders. Yet, how do you not make other people's pain your own after addressing so much human suffering? Certainly, I think, the way, your belief in humanitarianism and in a higher power certainly are a testament to that. But there are times when it's really hard to be empathetic and still be effective because, in a way, you're feeling so much the pain of other people. So how do you kind of manage that?
Yeah, thank you for that. There is a chapter in the book called A Dark Night that talks about trauma. And I share the story of being nearly killed in a car accident when I worked in South Africa. And I also share the story of losing a good friend and colleague when I worked in Afghanistan. And it's very difficult to experience people dying, and especially to experience this every day. There are times when I've worked in refugee camps where it's the middle of winter and you lose infants and elderly people who can't withstand the extreme temperatures. And it's very difficult to lose people every day in the work. But we have to be sure not to take the world on our shoulders. We have to find a way to be able to talk about these difficult experiences of life and death. And I encourage people to develop a support network, to share your experience with colleagues, to have a close circle of friends that you can talk to about your experiences. And at times, if needed, to debrief with a counselor. And I share a story about after working in the tsunami in Thailand, when I tried to help a little girl named Me, who was being abused and taken by police at night. And I tried to do everything I could for little Me, but I couldn't take her away from her family. I couldn't take her away from her home. And she was in an unsafe place. And when I came home, I just really emotionally suffered knowing that I couldn't make her fully safe. And I had to debrief with a counselor because I was very upset that I couldn't help her more. And sometimes we need the help of a trained counselor to deal with these challenges that we see, particularly when it relates to children. It's very difficult to see children suffer, particularly at young ages. And so it's very important when you experience trauma to take the time to work through those situations.
Well, and that also kind of segues into the last question I'll pose before heading over to the Q&A. But can you tell me, especially given our audience here, including a lot of young people, or also a lot of, people who mentor and coach young people.
Seasoned people. like you and me, I think we're seasoned now, Jane.
Yeah, so lots of I kind of my crone years now. But what's the best advice you've ever received, and what's the best advice you've ever given?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think really the best advice I ever received was to stay alive. And this may seem kind of like a joke, like, haha, like good luck, make it out, but one of my mentors told me that when I felt that I was in an environment where my life was in danger, to get out of that area and to be willing to leave. And this is very important because there were times in my life, and you read about them if you read the book, where my life was in danger and I did very risky things to try to help others. I tolerate a high level of risk, but every time I really felt that I was in serious danger, I was willing to leave. And this is very hard because some people just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And we know that a lot of humanitarians are held hostage and kidnapped and they don't make it out. Unfortunately, we lose people every year in this work. It's a hard line of work. And so I really took to heart this concept of self-preservation and taking responsibility for my own security and having a sense of danger and knowing when enough was enough. So that's a good thing. And probably the advice I give most often to people now is advice that I've had to take myself as well, which is to be an active listener. I'm an ideas person, so I always have so much on my mind. I'm always thinking about so many different things. And so to be an active listener is something that's hard for me as a human, as a manager, as a leader. And being an active listener is so important because it's really important to hear what people say, to hear what they say in their own language, in their own way of communicating, and then asking them, did you hear them correctly? Did you understand what they're saying, what they need? And it's so important not to try to solve people's problems for them, but to see yourself as being part of bringing a solution into being. But we are not the solution. We are not the answer, but we can be part of shaping an environment that is better and safer for our communities and for ourselves. So take that time to listen. It's hard when you're always having so many ideas you want to execute, but it's super important.
I'm right there with you. That's why I try to remind myself of my signature block, one of my favorite Dean Rusk quotes, which is the best way to persuade people is with your ears, by listening to them.
Yes, that's excellent.
But now let me turn to some of the great questions from our audience. So first, I love this one. What kind of remote work can humanitarians do? Can you talk about, online United Nations volunteers or other opportunities to do remote work as a humanitarian?
This is constantly changing and evolving and is something to watch out for. So I tell people, if you want to work in this sector and look for opportunities, some of the best websites to watch are Relief Web, which is run by UN OCHA, which coordinates the UN agencies and NGOs. And there is a jobs portal on there that has volunteer opportunities, traineeship opportunities, and they break the positions down by level of experience and by sector. So this is a great tool. Also, Idealist is a great tool for the US, particularly, and it's a good tool for international work too. but Idealist has great opportunities. And there's another website called UN Jobs that breaks down all the UN and humanitarian jobs by location. And these jobs tend to be more professionalized positions that you have to already have experience for. But watch for those job descriptions and look at what they're asking for, you know, and ask yourself how you can build up your repertoire so that you can meet the requirements for the type of jobs that you would like to have in the future, and use those as a tool. And of course, follow people and organizations on Twitter and LinkedIn. I see so many great jobs on LinkedIn all the time that I don't even see advertised other places. So, you know, just be on the watch because there are great opportunities at every level.
I think their algorithm probably has you all figured out.
I swear that those algorithms are getting smarter and smarter. And I keep thinking, how can I keep disseminating and sharing more, you know, because I constantly see things and I just don't even, I don't know. It's a wonderful thing that we're inundated with so much information. It's hard to know how to manage it all, right?
That's the truth.
Yeah.
Another great question. How can humanitarian work influence foreign policy? And I think, you know, we have a couple of high profile issues. You know, certainly Burma, Myanmar has been high on the agenda, Yemen as well. But how do you see humanitarian work influencing foreign policy?
Yeah, I think this is something that we have to continue to work on in the United States and globally, is by some people, a perception that humanitarian work is easy and that charitable work is not serious foreign policy. And it depends, of course, on the different administrations in the US government. But our foreign policy historically has always been very generous, donating to humanitarian agencies and supporting Americans in international organizations. But I think that we can do more to build regional consensus on managing crisis. And even today, I was speaking with someone about the situation in Myanmar and how the people there are crying out for democracy, and the protesters are being gunned down literally by the military. And someone asked me, you know, what can be done about Myanmar? And I said, we need an Asia regional bloc to force the military in Myanmar to stop persecuting and shooting at their own people. I mean, we can talk about democracy, but these days when the US talks about democracy, other governments remind us about Black Lives Matter, about people being killed by police in the streets. And, you know, they don't want to hear it from us right now. I mean, how great are we perceived at equality and inclusiveness? I mean, the US is trying to be a more perfect union, but I think some other countries are more easily influenced by their regional partners, and we need to be better at working with those blocks of nations to, you know, not just look like we're trying to have things go our way, but we want a safer world, you know, region by region, I think. And certainly the State Department has regional bureaus that work on this, but we can have a humanitarian agenda for every region.
Yeah, you remind me of an opinion editorial I saw today in the Washington Post by our Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. Ambassador at the UN. And that's exactly what she was calling for, that this can't be, you know, one nation or just the Security Council members. This really has to be, you know, many partners, particularly partners in the region. And also, I think you touched upon an important thing, kind of going also back to the issue of what can you do remotely. But I know both you and I as Red Crossers have used the International Federation of the Red Cross Learning Platform, which offers a wider range of, and you just register and take it, it's all free. But they also have a program on humanitarian diplomacy, because humanitarian diplomacy really is a subset of different types of diplomacy. And certainly no one is better versed on that than Linda Thomas Greenfield.
So she's amazing.
She is. She's my she-ra.
She's amazing. Yeah, we're so lucky to have her as the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and she has just been hitting it out of the park. And I teach undergraduates, and I've been sharing some of her speeches with my classes, and she's just a marvelous example of someone who's transcended adversity to come to leadership, and who's very honest on the world stage about our place, and but also, you know, pretty serious about telling countries, you know, look, you have to chart your own path forward. And, you know, we're here to help, but we're also here to encourage, right? And certainly we see a number of places where conflict has continued despite all of our diplomatic efforts in Syria and Yemen, in Ethiopia and Myanmar, these places, also Venezuela. You know, these places are full of people in serious, dire need, and helping them in humanitarian ways is only part of the solution that will bring peace to those parts of the world.
And in fact, that segues into a question from another participant who notes that Yemen is facing the largest humanitarian crisis in the world after 5 years of continuous war. What are we doing wrong in that part of the world, and what should we do better?
Yeah, Yemen is so tricky. And as we know, in the last administration, there was a resolution of Congress to stop providing weapons to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has been part of providing weapons to the conflict in Yemen. And this is part of how US weapons have also been dropped in Yemen. Although we don't directly sell weapons to the parties to the conflict, because the US has arms trade with Saudi Arabia, we do know that weapons made in the United States are killing civilians in Yemen. And this is reprehensible, I think, to the entire US Congress and to every humanitarian agency that has tried to advocate for peace and an end to the conflict in Yemen. Is at a bare minimum, there should be no US weapons dropped in Yemen. And so we see the new administration has made a commitment to this as well. But we need Saudi Arabia and other partners in the Gulf states to also be committed to ending the conflict. And again, you know, talking about regional solutions, the Gulf states are full of wealthy oil-rich nations that are also very generous in spirit and humanitarian donors. And their commitment to ending the war has to be very strong. And they have to put more regional pressure on all the parties to the conflict to stop fighting.
Very good. Another participant here, Noah Amaris, asked a great question. He says, your title, Bring Rain, brings up the subject of climate issues. How do we in Europe cope with the potential for vast African immigration?
Yeah, thank you for this important question. And the climate crisis is real. And, you know, a lot of people misunderstand the climate crisis, and particularly, you know, earlier ways of talking about it, focusing on global warming. We know that the climate crisis means that our environment is going through many shifts, and these shifts are causing extremities in our atmospherics, and they're causing an exacerbated and unprecedented number of different types of disasters. All kinds of storms, including wildfires, are part of this extreme conditions that we're facing. And I think that I said recently to another group, if we really believe that climate change is real, we would see much more intervention at the local level, at the country level. We know what areas are at risk, particularly because you mentioned African migration to Europe. It's automatically making me think about the Sahel region, which is very dry, where a lot of people are migrating up through the Sahel going through the Sahara Desert to reach Libya and Spain, and various routes that migrants take. And this is a very dangerous journey, and it's inevitable that the more routes that people have access to, the more people are going to try to go. And we know that young people are also increasingly making the journey through the desert up to Europe. And so one of the answers to this is not only mitigating the impact of climate change, but economic development and helping people make transitions. So when you have a population that is focused solely on farming, and there is a drought and they're not able to plant their crops or yield a harvest, they have to have a secondary source of income. They need some other type of livelihood so that they don't become destitute when the dry season lasts too long. And so there are many different ways of intervening to help people have secondary and tertiary sources of income so that they can stay in place. And then so much has been written about mitigation of climate change on specific countries, but I really think we have to focus on the young people in Africa, in the Sahel, who really feel like they don't have any future jobs available to them, that their future is literally drying up. And we know that they can do many things. And we see a renaissance in some African cities. We look at Lagos in Nigeria and Nairobi in Kenya, and we look at Dakar in Senegal, and we know that innovation and technology and healthcare and industry, all of this is possible on the continent. And so we need to find a way to really encourage young people that they can have a future in their home countries too.
Great. Here's a question from Rachel Carpenter I love. What are the most common misperceptions new people entering the humanitarian field struggle with?
Gosh, I think, well, one of the things is that I think you believe when you enter this field that you are going to change the world. You believe that you are almost invincible in a way. And I would say some of this has to do with youth. When I was in my 20s, I was maybe more bright-eyed than I am now. And I think it's good to have this idealism, to have this bright spirit and the energy that it takes to do the hard work. I mean, humanitarians work very, very long hours, and they almost never really rest, not when you're dealing with a major emergency. And certainly I know people in the US that are running vaccine clinics right now, both with the military and state emergency management agencies and doctors and nurses. And I can guarantee you that they are tired and they are working around the clock to get the vaccine to as many people as possible. And this work is long and hard and relatively exhausting. And it can kind of burn out that bright fire that's in young people when they think that they're going to keep changing the world. And then they go out there and it's endless need, endless millions of people who need that vaccine who have not gotten it yet. There's thousands of children in the refugee camp, and you know what? They're all on the brink of being malnourished, and you only have so many places to give them additional supplements. You only have so much time before the weather's going to change and those children might not make it through, and these realities, they kind of hurt the soul of a person. But we have to realize that human suffering is part of the human condition, and you have to go into it knowing you're not going to be able to save everyone. And I keep going back to COVID because I think of the many doctors and nurses who sadly have lost their own lives caring for COVID patients. And this is the same in the Ebola epidemic. in parts of West Africa and the Congo. Doctors and nurses who, while caring for others, lost their lives. And so we have to recognize this harsh reality that helping is not easy. Helping is hard work. And really, you have to go back to that conversation we had about preserving your own life and not taking the world on your shoulders. And it's very difficult when you're in a caring profession to keep doing this, but you have to eat right, you have to exercise, you know, you have to pray and meditate and believe and lean on your support network in order to make it through those difficult moments when you just realize that what you're doing is not enough. And you know what, but what you're doing is valuable and important work. And there's something to be celebrated in that too.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think many of the great things reflect the accumulation of many small things. I think you were also probably more savvy and altruistic. I have to admit, early in my career, I tended to put myself at the center of the story. And I found that taking myself out of the center of the story made my story more powerful, more meaningful, and made, you know, whatever I could do more effective for others. I think you've been doing that all along, though. I had to climb a slightly steeper learning, especially when I was younger. But,
well, I think that people teach us, you know, and there's a lot of people in this book who taught me powerful lessons. And they do teach us, and especially when we're a guest coming from the United States, and also being, you know, a white foreigner, a female foreigner, a young foreigner, all these social labels carry significance. And people teach us about themselves and their life and culture, and they correct us. And so, you know, you will be corrected when you make mistakes in this field, and you have to be open to that. And that helps keep you humble.
that is true. I know one of the most useful concepts I received from military colleagues was the concept of sleep discipline, you know, sleep when you can. I'll say that was especially helpful to me when I was a mother of a newborn. It's like, I got to get in my sleep discipline. But we have a
Good
great
advice. Good advice.
when we're having this blurry, you know, online phase where we evenings and weekends all seem to run in together. But we have a great question here about asking about how you see the relationship between military and humanitarian work, particularly in areas of conflict. And could you speak a little bit on how that partnership works when oftentimes, you know, agendas can be very different?
Yeah. I have been doing civil military work for more than 10 years now, and the organization that I founded, Protect the People, which is no longer an operational agency, but I ran that entity for 10 years before teaching at the Army War College. And I was committed to civil military dialogue and relations, partially because my technical expertise is in the area of protection and keeping people safe from danger. And the humanitarian idea of protection is really based in international law and human rights. And I always felt that there was a gap in the provision of physical protection for people's integrity. How do we keep people from being killed, from being injured, from being raped? And this is a form of physical protection that we see is really the role of the security sector, of police and military and border control. And because I just got tired of seeing people physically hurt and killed, I decided that I wanted to work alongside the security sector and to teach and train the military about humanitarian protection. And it's not an easy road, and it's a little bit easier when there's a natural disaster or an emergency that doesn't involve armed conflict, where you're just meeting people's needs, or you're trying to keep the infrastructure from collapsing, you're trying to keep the energy power grid going, keep the water resources going. But when you're in an armed conflict and the military is a party to the conflict and they have the authority to kill what they perceive to be legitimate targets, it's very difficult to be a part of these discussions. And it's not a comfortable role to engage in civil military dialogue because we do see things differently. Humanitarians, our goal is to save people's lives and reduce suffering. And for the military, their mission may be to go after a particular enemy, to go after a particular target, to achieve a certain national security objective. And we may not agree about that objective as humanitarians, but if we can try to focus on some shared goals and concepts, that helps. And certainly I have been part of establishing military doctrine for the United States on the protection of civilians. I have also done this with NATO, and I've trained all the different NATO nations, 29 militaries, on protecting civilians in conflict. And I think every time we have an open dialogue, there's room for progress. It doesn't mean that we're gonna agree all the time, but every time we can have a meaningful exchange, I think it does a world of good.
Yeah, and I know that you've been up there in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and working with the Army War College. And I'm curious, I put you a little bit on the spot here because I know it's about 5 or 6 years ago that the Army War Field Manual was revised. And it really strengthened the components in it in terms of how to operationalize, Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law, which are also in the Uniform Code of Military Justice and US law. So I'm curious, given the span of time that you've worked with, military actors, including the US military, have you seen that to kind of be a helpful step forward, or has it made a difference?
Yeah, I should say that all my comments and remarks and everything in the book is my personal reflection and doesn't reflect anything that the US government or the US Army or any other official source would say. So in my personal capacity, I think that all of the tools and training, the doctrine, the training exercises, I think all of it is helpful. And very recently, NATO came out with a public version of an operational handbook for their commands on protection of civilians. And this is something that myself and many other colleagues had been working on for many years. And so it was really nice to see a public version of this document released. And it's a source of pride, really, because we see situations like the conflict in Libya, where the US put a lot of pressure on NATO to protect civilians in Libya from Muammar Gaddafi. And at the time, the operational commands, they didn't understand what it meant to protect civilians from harm. They knew that civilians were in danger, but they didn't know exactly what it would take to make them safe, particularly because the mission in Libya had no ground component. It was an entirely air-led campaign. So how do you protect people when you don't have any boots on the ground? This was a big challenge for operators. And so this handbook kind of helps address the different steps that military planners can take and offer some helpful case studies. And so I'm really happy to see that these tools are out there and available. And I hope that people use them to the maximum opportunity to help guide future operations.
Well, that's really exciting, and congratulations. I wasn't aware of that, and that's a really invaluable contribution. So, congratulations. Thank you. And then we have a wonderful question here. What's better, a short-term mission or volunteer trip, or financial donations when there's a humanitarian crisis, and why? And I know, for instance, this came up a lot in the US with regards to the Haiti earthquake, but you could pick and choose any number of examples, but go ahead, or Hurricane Katrina too, for that matter.
Yeah. Which is better? It's such a good question. I think it depends on what your role is at any given time. So for example, we told this story about Chicambuso in Zambia. And when I joined the board, all the board members committed to going to Zambia. And every year that I thought about going to Zambia, I would add up how much it would cost and how much time it would take them to host me And I just wrote a check and I donated that money at the end of the year because I thought I believe in what they're doing. I know what they're doing. I know they're full of integrity, and it's going to take so much time and energy for them to receive me. And why would I, spend a few $1,000s on a plane ticket when they can do so much good for the families if I write a check at the end of the year as part of my tax donation. So that's one way of looking at it. But I also think that volunteering does have its place. I am a big fan of giving money, giving cash instead of things. We know that that's the most effective way to help agencies. But when you have relationships with people in communities, you see very clearly the nature of the problems and the complexity that even though a small amount of money helps, having that understanding of reality on the ground for people is really important. And I think this is even true in the United States. You don't have to go very far to find people in need. You can go across the street. You can go, across town. You can engage with nonprofits in your community. You can participate in town halls. You can talk to the police in your community about what they're doing to increase public safety in a way that is inclusive and equitable. All of us have this possibility to do this right here at home within our own communities. And so I always say you don't have to get on a plane, but if you do have the desire to go or to make this a career, certainly work in partnership with a local organization, follow the lead of local leaders, pay respect to everyone that you work with. And like I said, be willing to listen and be willing to learn from them, and be willing to have your own mind changed and your own heart changed. And one of my favorite reviews of Bring Rain by Daryl Byler said, humanitarian work is mutually transformative. It changes us as people. We want to change the world, but the world changes us as we learn and we grow from serving others.
Well, that's, I think, kind of a wonderful way to kind of wrap up this hour. I do want to be able to turn it back over to Jesse Herman, but first, Sarah, let me just say it's wonderful to see you again. I couldn't put down the book. I kept using my trusty highlighter, and my book is like bleeding yellow all over it. This is the second highlighter I've gone through. So thank you so much for being with us. And Jesse, let me go ahead and turn it over to you to close it out.
Sarah, I think that is just such a beautiful review for us to kind of end this session with, and something for us to think about as we're all moving forward. I think this conversation has been so inspiring and certainly very motivational about the impact that just one person can have on the world. So Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and background with us. And we certainly hope to host you one day in Charlotte in person.
Yes, I would love
to get back to our in-person events.
Thank you,
to our attendees.
Thank you, Jane.
We hope to see all of you again at another upcoming program soon, and we encourage you all to become members of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. That's the only way we're able to provide these types of global content programs for our community. So with that, I will go ahead and adjourn this meeting, and we hope to see everyone again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.